Thank you for joining me today, Lloyd. Would you like to give a quick introduction about your role at Attwells?
So my name's Lloyd Clark. I'm a partner here at Attwells Solicitors, and I head up our employment law department.
Due to the recent budget, the national insurance has gone up.
hmm
So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, starting off with what is the national insurance increase
Yep.
and how might this impact individuals as well as businesses?
Okay. So first things first. So every employer will usually pay employer national insurance contributions as well as employees paying national insurance contributions. So the changes that have recently been made won't come into effect until April this year. So as we stand here now in February 2025, currently an employer will pay 13.8% on an employee's earnings, anything over £9,100. So with effect from April this year, because of the recent budget changes that were announced by Labour, that's going to increase to 15% of any of workers' wages over £5,000. That's quite a dramatic increase.
Yeah. And how would that affect employees across different contract types? So 0 hour contract or part time, full time?
Yeah, I mean, the potential implications of it are really wide. So you might even see in shops, for instance, that because businesses are now having to incur more costs, we
Yeah.
might see prices rise for your every day-to-day things in shops, clothes, food, whatever it might be. We're also likely to see things like recruitment freezes with employers, and that will apply regardless of the contract type. We're also going to see things such as possible redundancies, which some businesses might make. And in terms of contract types specifically, if you're a 0 hours contract worker, for instance, you might see your hours being cut. If you're freelance, so you're self-employed, this might give you somewhat of a bit of a competitive advantage in the sense that self-employed people, an employer, it's not strictly their employer, but who they contract with, they're not responsible for their employer national insurance contributions. So from that perspective, it may be cheaper purely in a national insurance sense to employ someone who's freelance or self-employed as opposed to an employee.
Yeah. And how might that impact small businesses?
Yeah, I mean, small businesses is going to impact quite a lot again. So you're looking at things like your national insurance bill is going to increase. There may be things like we're coming around now to sort of the end of the financial year, so this national insurance increase, a lot of employers will be budgeting for what that's going to cost in the next financial year, which usually runs April to April every year. So you're going to see things possibly like salary rises being restricted, again, recruitment freezes. It's going to be one part of it. So there's lots of different ways that this is going to affect businesses, small businesses in particular. They may, in some respects, have had a disproportionate effect, albeit something that's gone slightly under the radar, is that Labour have actually made some caveats for small businesses. So if you're a small business, there is some allowances that they're making for small businesses. So for instance, for small businesses or SMEs, small medium enterprises, they're actually going to increase the employment allowance at which point an employer has to pay their national insurance contributions. At the percentage, they're going to raise that from £5,000 to £10,500. So I think there's going to be around a million SMEs who are going to either pay less or the same amount of national insurance contributions after the budget or when they come in April. And you're going to have around 8,500,000 SMEs who are not going to pay national insurance at all. So for some SMEs, it's going to affect it, but then the government have, and again, something that's gone under the radar a little bit in the news coverage, that they have made some allowances for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And talking about more like the redundancy side, how does a business ensure that they're following a fair redundancy?
That's a good question. So it's always really important to get legal advice first and foremost. So always get it at an early stage. From a lawyer's perspective, if we're involved at an early stage, we can map the process out as opposed to getting involved when something goes wrong, which unfortunately does happen sometimes. From an employer's perspective, the sort of three key points I'd say would be first off, make sure there's a genuine redundancy situation. So what that means is there's generally three types of redundancy situations. So your first type is there's a business closure. Obviously, if business closes, there's no requirement for those roles anymore. A workplace closure. So if you have two offices and one office closes down, that's another type. And perhaps much probably the most common type of redundancy is a reduced requirement for someone in that role. So that doesn't always have to result in a reduced headcount, but you'll see sometimes, for instance, a good example would be in Sainsbury's. I pop in Sainsbury's now and again. If you pop in Sainsbury's, you'll have your self-service checkouts.
Yeah.
And that's a change where previously, 5-10 years ago, you would actually have a human being who would serve you. And because of technological advances, you now don't have those. So there's a reduced requirement for people to fill that role.
So step by step, what should a business do?
Following a fair procedure is really important. So probably the few key points you need to cover off. You need to warn and consult any potentially redundant staff. You need to ensure that if you're making more than one member of staff redundant, that you follow objective selection criteria, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You've also got to ensure that you are looking for alternative employment. So redundancy, making someone redundant should be the last option. So if you can find another position for them in the business, try and find that position. And lastly, if you do end up dismissing someone, then you should always give them the opportunity to appeal wherever possible, particularly where someone's been employed for more than 2 years because they have unfair dismissal rights. And if you do terminate someone's employment, you should make sure, if it is by reason of redundancy and they've been employed for more than 2 years, that you pay them the statutory redundancy pay in addition to their notice pay and any accrued holiday. And there's some really useful calculators on the gov.uk website for working all of that stuff out. It's very user friendly.
So what would happen if an employer got the redundancy process wrong?
So usually that would result in a claim in the employment tribunal. So there would probably be 3 things that are likely to happen. First and foremost, if someone's been employed for more than 2 years, then they have rights with respect to unfair dismissal. So that can result in a claim for unfair dismissal in the employment tribunal. And in terms of what that can cost an employer, in terms of in addition to legal fees, so employees can be awarded up to 52 weeks' pay or up to £115,000. Whichever of those two is the lower. If an employer is making more than 20 people redundant at once as well, in addition to those things that we've already talked about, they can also incur what's called a protective award, which can be up to 90 days actual gross pay per employee. So if you're talking about 30 or 40 employees, it can be a huge sum of money if you get this stuff wrong. And probably the last one is discrimination. So there are some instances where people will be made redundant and they will allege that they've been made redundant because of a discriminatory reason. So if they have a disability, because of their sexuality, because of their race, and the compensation for that is uncapped. So again, it can be huge sums of money we can be talking about.
That's really interesting. And is there any advice that you would give to any employees or employers regarding the national insurance increase?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, get your sums right, because there is going to be a big increase that's going to go in with this employer national insurance increase for the national living wage. So that's going up, I think, around 7% for 21 plus and around 15-16% to 18 to 20. So they're quite large increases off the back of obviously increased costs with the inflation that we've been experiencing as well. So that's really important. Another thing, which again is probably gone a little bit under the radar, is to look to try and take advantage of any employee benefits. So there are some things that you can do as an employer to try and reduce your national insurance liabilities. So things like electric car schemes, increased pension contributions, because what they will do is they will actually reduce down the amount that's taxable in respect to national insurance contributions. So I would advise employers to do that. And if you're an SME, look at these increased employment allowances as well and take full advantage of them.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.